Some time ago, I mentioned how the disintegration of the Pakistani state was the conflict that by far worried me the most. At the time, it was because of the Pakistani state's own difficulties in controlling parts of its territory, which were influenced by the Afghan Taliban, its former ally. The situation is worsening, increasing the risk of conflict with India. However, this conflict is also dangerous for reasons beyond the large populations of both countries. It's also dangerous because there's a nuclear risk since both countries have nuclear weapons. And also, and this is a major point, it could end up drawing other powers into a scenario of indirect conflict. So the India-Pakistan situation is much more complicated than people are saying out there. And we're going to look at this in detail in today's video. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know. Your support may not seem impressive, but it's extremely important. Above all, as much bigger channels come here to get information and then replicate it on their own channels. After all, this is the only real geopolitics channel in Portuguese, so your support is very important. I'm Geopolitical Mundial and this is the Geopolitical Mundial channel. On May 6th, India launched Operation Sindor, a retaliatory attack for the militant attack on April 22nd in Paraugam, Jammu and Kashmir, which left 26 dead. According to the Indian government, Pakistan allegedly supported the group that carried out the attack. Thus, the Indian operation consisted of missiles launched from Indian territory, hitting 9 targets. In Pakistan and the Pakistan-occupied parts of Kashmir, during the operation, 5 fighter jets, according to Pakistani sources, were reportedly shot down by Pakistan's anti-aircraft systems. For now, 4 have been confirmed, which shows that it won't be an easy war for either side if the escalation increases and actually turns into an open war. India's Ministry of Defense claims that all the targets were part of terrorist infrastructure and that the attacks deliberately excluded Pakistani military installations. Even so, Prime Minister Pakistan has reported that retaliatory attacks were already underway against Indian targets. Setting aside conventional military capability, neither country can afford to underestimate the other. After all, both possess nuclear capability. And moreover, Pakistan is trying to emerge from a historic political and economic crisis, while India is trying to turn its regional successes into global power. And it is dealing with a growing Muslim population that sympathizes with Pakistan and is hostile to movements considered nationalist, which means Hindu, Sikh and Buddhist movements. A military escalation between the two countries could disrupt both South and Central Asia, but it would also end up impacting the geopolitical dynamics of the planet, involving the United States, Russia and China in a certain way. This is due to another chess game, which confuses those who see the world as split in two. Because from the indigenous perspective, Pakistan to the north, as China's main ally, isolates and contains any Indian ambitions toward the north, towards Central Asia. Additionally, growing Chinese influence in Bangladesh threatens the country's entire eastern flank from India's perspective. To make matters worse, Pakistan has a nuclear program only because the United States covertly supported it in the 1980s. It also has a history of working with the United States in intelligence, a large amount of American weapons, American military advisors within the Pakistani army itself, and an extensive network of economic and political collaboration between the Pakistani government and the government of England. It goes further, as Middle Eastern regimes like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates often collaborate with Pakistan. Not only in the past, even having financed its nuclear program, but today with joint military exercises that are routinely carried out. In other words, Indians see China, the United States, England, and the Islamic countries of the Middle East as collaborators with Pakistan. A threat that, for Indians, is existential. The feeling of isolation. Containment made Indians, since the Cold War, seek deep cooperation with Moscow. Whether it was the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation today, this Russian-Pakistani inconvenience is a result of when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, because Pakistan served as a connection for the Afghan Mujahideen to be equipped and trained by the CIA and the Chinese Secret Service. The weapons passed through Pakistan and went inside. At the time, The Pakistanis feared that if Afghanistan fell into the hands of the Soviet Union, the Soviets would then proceed to invade the province of Baluchistan to the south, seeking the warm seas to serve as a permanent naval base in the Indian Ocean. Later, with the Soviet collapse, Pakistan collaborated extensively with Chechen insurgents during the Chechen Wars in the 1990s, putting Russia's own integrity at risk. And, at the same time, the Russians, since their clashes with the Chinese back in the 1960s, saw the Indians as a counterbalance to the growing Chinese influence in Central Asia. This relationship kept getting closer and closer over the decades between Moscow and New Delhi. Recently, with the conflict in Ukraine, Western sanctions and embargoes hit the Russian economy, which became hyper-dependent on exports and imports to China, and to avoid becoming even more dependent on future decisions from Beijing, Moscow then tried to further strengthen its relations with New Delhi. And the Indians, in turn, were concerned that a weakened Russia could, in the future, lead to Chinese hegemony on the continent. It maintained trade and even expanded cooperation with the Russians, resisting enormous pressure from Western countries to adopt anti-Russian policies, even though there is cooperation among the three countries in the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Russia, India, and China. Ensuring a balance between Russia and China is a priority for New Delhi, which is not dazzled by its robust increase in trade with China. Especially because the Indian perception is that with China controlling Tibet and, as a consequence, most of the Himalayas, the Indians are in an extremely fragile position, worsened and aggravated by the Pakistani factor I mentioned earlier. That's because from Tibet, a relatively empty territory without major strategic targets, the Chinese not only gained direct access to the Indian geopolitical core, but they also managed to control a huge part of its water supply. After all, the rivers that come from the Tibetan Plateau region supply India. All of this reinforces, for the Indians, the need for a Russia that is at least capable of safeguarding and pressuring the Chinese in case of an emergency. And as the Muslim population grows in India, whether through migration from Pakistan itself or from Bangladesh or even from the Rohingya expelled from Myanmar, Islam has also been growing internally among Indians themselves, especially among the so-called Dalits, the caste considered impure and marginalized in Hinduism. And because they are marginalized, they look to Islam as a way out of absolute poverty. The result, then, is the growing increase in religious and cultural conflicts within India. These conflicts have been the target of heavy rhetoric and attacks from London and Washington, which criticize the Indian government as being intolerant toward Islamic minorities. So basically, the Indian perception is one of paranoia and geopolitical containment, with the Western powers and China cooperating, not only for its containment but even for its breakup, for its balkanization. We also have the Pakistani view. For Pakistanis, China is their only trusted partner. That's because, despite its relations with the United States and England, the country views the interference of these two countries in its internal affairs with great suspicion. And that's not for nothing, because during the Afghanistan war, Pakistan sheltered members of Al-Qaeda and Taliban fugitives within its territory. Even with cells from these organizations frequently attacking NATO forces in Afghanistan and other Middle Eastern countries, it always kind of seemed like the Pakistani government was giving cover to these cells. The support and guarantee to the Taliban was seen by Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, as a way that, in the future, after the war, after the withdrawal of Western forces from Afghanistan, the Pakistanis would have a broad advantage and influence over the government in Kabul. This led to several occasions where United States drone strikes were carried out inside Pakistani territory, which greatly displeased the Pakistani government. In fact, Osama bin Laden, the most wanted man in the world after September 11, 2001, was hiding inside Pakistan, less than a kilometer from the country's main Pakistani military base. The Pakistani government always claimed it had no control over these organizations and did not support them, but at the same time, it did nothing against them, giving indications to the West that either the Islamabad government knew and simply turned a blind eye to the terrorist cells, or knew and protected them on purpose. This ambiguity of not making things clear. Pakistan's stance was useful because it allowed them to wage this indirect war against the West and gain influence over Afghanistan, but without getting directly involved. The Pakistanis saw the Indian Navy being able to blockade their coastline and also putting enormous pressure on critical areas, combined with the feelings of shame from the wars lost against the Indians. It makes Pakistan feel that New Delhi's goal is to control its entire eastern flank near Kashmir, so that they become isolated from their connective border with China at the same time, and see Russia as a resentful and potentially vengeful actor, which could then put pressure on the country from the north. After the chaos following the United States' withdrawal from Afghanistan, its control and influence over Kabul did not materialize. On the contrary, the Afghan Taliban, its former ally, turned against Islamabad and began supporting armed groups in the Baluchistan region. In other words, the Pakistanis, who previously feared an Indian offensive to the east, isolating them from China, now also fear insurgencies to the west, isolating them from direct contact with Iran, and consequently, from the Middle East. And the West has been constantly applying sanctions and accusations to pressure the Pakistani government. So they see this while India has been courted by the major powers, even by China itself, with the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa initiative. Benefiting from agreements with Israel, France, and the United States, it has strengthened its conventional and nuclear arsenal and continues to seek power projection in the region and the entire Indian Ocean. The Pakistanis would be geographically isolated by India and the Taliban, while at the same time being economically and technologically isolated by the Western powers. So Islamabad feels that its interior would also be simmering due to economic difficulties imposed by these Western sanctions, running serious risks of even seeing a future civil war, which also makes the Pakistani government paranoid about the actions of other countries. In other words, and this is the point, Indians and Pakistanis are very suspicious not only of each other, but also of the actions of other powers. The geopolitical perception of both countries is literally chaotic, sometimes even contradictory. Both interact with everyone but also distrust everyone. Both feel isolated and like victims of an international conspiracy. And the worst part is that both of them might actually be right. This makes the situation more sensitive and worsens an already nuclear scenario. It's only not worse because both countries depend on importing weapons and military equipment from abroad. Neither of them is self-sufficient enough to start a conventional conflict. India is trying to become self-sufficient, but that's it, it's still trying. Pakistan isn't and hardly has any chance. And I say that because of this the situation isn't worse, but this very point could also be the reason for things to get worse. Because it could end up involving even more powers in this game that's already very chaotic. And this factor of being dependent on arms imports is something very important to consider. Because India has an air power of more than 680 combat aircraft and Pakistan has around 410. But with a huge caveat. Out of the total jets that Pakistan has, about 75 are F-16s bought from the United States. And the problem with that is that the United States has restricted the use of these fighters against India due to end-user agreements. In other words, the F-16s supplied to the Pakistanis cannot be used against India. They can only be used for counter-terrorism purposes. Especially regarding Afghanistan, you might think Pakistan could ignore this, and they actually could. But if they do that, they risk having spare parts and maintenance contracts suspended, or even facing even greater sanctions. In 2019, for example, Pakistan allegedly violated this rule by reportedly sending jets for airstrikes against Indian military installations in Jammu and Kashmir. At the time, however, the United States quietly took the lead on this issue. We don't know how, just that Pakistan disliked it. Pakistan can, however, rely on its much larger fleet of J-10C fighter jets made in China, which surpass the F-16s in terms of speed, range, radar, and missile capability. These fighter jets already come equipped with the PL-15-1 of China's long-range air-to-air missiles, which is more advanced, and which is seen as a counterpoint to the valuable Rafale jets from France that were sold to India and ended up being shot down during Operation Sindor. The idea of this confusion of sides is the idea I want you to grasp. Russia is a vital ally of India, which bought $60 billion in Russian weapons, accounting for about 65% of its total arms imports. Pakistan's key ally, China, sponsors the $65 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and also a supplier of many of its weapons. And the United States, which officially has relations with both but has more ties with Pakistan, especially because historically both Washington and London have always acted against India's Panduist movements, having sponsored and supported Pakistan precisely to contain the Indians. In other words, the global rivals, China and the United States, both support Pakistan, while the allies China and Russia oppose each other on the issue of India. But then we had Operation Sindor in India. This operation took place in Kashmir, which is a region disputed between India, Pakistan, Gilgit in green, and with China controlling Aksai Chin in red to the northeast. On April 22, 2025, Islamic militants attacked tourists in Pahalgan, Indian Kashmir, killing 25 Indians and a Nepali. The Indian government blamed Pakistan-aligned groups and reacted by halting Chenab River water projects, sealing borders and expelling Pakistani diplomats. And here is just one very important thing. Many channels reported that India's river blockades would dry up Pakistan. And no, that's an exaggeration. Not all rivers can be blocked by the Indians. No, Pakistan won't dry up completely. And even if it could, we have to remember that India, in support of Pakistan, could also disrupt the flow of many rivers that go to India. Although they can't do that with all of them either. If the conflict were to become nuclear, it would be the greatest humanitarian disaster in history. Ignore the First and Second World Wars. The Indo-Pakistani potential exceeds anything before and, if realized, could contaminate the region based on nuclear weapon use. A nuclear conflict, depending on the amount of nuclear weapons, could contaminate the entire Ganges basin, affecting the most populated part of India and the overpopulated and poor Bangladesh. Depending on the wind directions and the intensities of the nuclear devices, it would also reach the rivers that come from the Tibetan Plateau heading south, contaminating the Southeast Asian region, which would affect Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and even Vietnam. Since the Himalayan mountain range is very difficult to cross, it could even be easily patrolled by the Chinese armed forces. This would cause large numbers of refugees to end up heading towards Central Asia, which would create instability through Afghanistan in the form of refugees and radical militants. This widespread disorder could spread insecurity to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, where there is already cross-border militancy, such as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which has pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda, and this instability will cause a sharp slowdown in foreign investment and in the local economy itself. The region's economy has already endured lost decades, from the Afghan Civil War in 1992 to the end of NATO's occupation. In 2021, these countries have tried to connect more with the global economy and have faced difficulties, and in this scenario, that would come to an end. This could also further leverage the disorder on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to put pressure on the government in Kabul, which risks further strengthening Al-Qaeda throughout the entire region. The disorder in Balochistan province, Pakistan's poorest region, could empower local separatists and draw in Iran, which has also faced a Baloch insurgency on its side of the border. In this scenario, about 80% of the Silk Road Initiative would simply come to an end, which would throw the world economy, already struggling, into a severe and indefinite recession. Where could all this instability eventually lead? It's speculative, but it would definitely be something disastrous. The thing is to hope that this increasingly likely scenario doesn't happen. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and a special thanks to super members Lucas Silva de Souza and Az Portas. Bye.